Hello, and welcome to You Should Hear This, a podcast for the Everyday Association professional. I'm Chris Beeman, your host. Today's podcast is brought to you by Visit Bloomington. In the heart of the U.S. Midwest, Bloomington, Indiana is the perfect place to host a small to mid-sized meeting, convention, or conference. Offering unique and flexible venues available to groups of up to 400 people, as well as a hub for higher education at Indiana University, a nationally revered culinary scene, and natural wonders like the Hoosier National Forest and Monroe Lake, Bloomington is sure to wow your guests during and after your event. Go to visitbloomington.com to start planning your next meeting. Dr. Dan Wendler is a licensed clinical psychologist and therapist. He's a two-time TEDx speaker and author of multiple books, including an Amazon best-selling title, Improve Your Social Skills, and a recently co-authored audiobook, Neurodiversity and the Myth of Normal. Dan's qualifications and experience also include being proudly autistic and a neurodiversity advocate. Dr. Dan's work focuses on providing practical advice and strategies to help everyone, whether neurotypical or neurodivergent, improve their social interactions and build better social connections. Today, we're going to dive into the topic of neurodiversity and the myth of normal to help association leaders understand and embrace neurodiversity, ensuring that their associations cater to the needs of all members, regardless of their neurological difference. Welcome, Dan.
It's great to be here, Chris. I'm excited to dive into this topic.
Absolutely. So is there anything about your work, expertise, or life that wasn't conveyed in your brief bio that you'd like for listeners to know about? Maybe you'd be willing to share a bit about your personal journey and how it's influenced your work and advocacy?
Yeah, I think that I'd love to share a little bit about that. I think that the thing that's really important for people to know is that this isn't just something that is an area of professional expertise for me as a psychologist and as an author, but it's something that's really personally important. When I was growing up as a kid in the Midwest, I didn't know that I was autistic. All I knew is that I was weird. I was different from the other kids, and that sort of no matter how hard I tried to fit in, I really couldn't find a place of acceptance. And so I experienced all of the bullying, rejection, et cetera, that you would expect a kid going through those experiences to have. And that was an awful time. But as I continued my story, as I got older, as I learned to connect better with others and find others that were more accepting of me, I also encountered the flip side of how meaningful and wonderful community and relationships and places of acceptance can be. And so I think that my life has really been transformed by these concepts of social connection and communities and inclusion. And so I'm really passionate to be able to be on podcasts like this one and share these ideas because I've seen how powerful it is in my own life, and I want to make that impact for as many other people as possible.
And we're so grateful that you're here. I think, I don't mind sharing with listeners that just preparing for this podcast, it's challenged my own understanding and awareness of what neurodiversity even is and means. And so I'm hoping that as much as I've learned, I can help facilitate some of that for our listeners today. So I think let's start at the foundation level with a definition of neurodiversity. Can you provide an overview of what neurodiversity means and why it's such an important concept to understand?
For sure. So neurodiversity, it's essentially just a way of understanding human differences that I think provides a pathway to responding to those differences that is more likely to let everybody flourish. And this isn't a new idea. It's been around for a while, but it's only been in recent years that it's kind of started to enter the mainstream and really shape the conversation, which is awesome. And I think the best way to understand neurodiversity is to kind of break it down into a couple of core ideas and then one metaphor that I think will sort of communicate those ideas in a good way. So the core ideas are number one, you know, people's brains and nervous systems function in different ways, and that's okay. Certain kinds of functioning are more common or more typical than others. But just like we wouldn't say that being tall is better than being short, we wouldn't say that one kind of brain is, better or worse than another kind of brain. The other thing that's important to realize is that the different abilities that we have are shaped by the environment that we find ourselves in. And so by environment, I mean things like the the social norms and expectations, or the physical environment itself. If, for instance, I go into a kindergarten classroom and I try to sit in a chair, I'm going to have a very hard time sitting in a chair because that environment wasn't designed for me as an adult. And in the same way, our environments are often designed for neurotypical people, but not for neurodivergent people. And then finally, if we can change our environments, if we can change how we sort of expect people to behave as a society, or the resources that we make available to people, so that not just typical needs are met, but that everybody's needs are met, then everybody's going to have a chance to thrive and flourish, including neurodivergent people. And that many of these things that we look at, that we see as sort of deficits or problems inherent in a particular diagnosis, are actually more problems just based on how we respond to that diagnosis. And so if we can change our response, we can change the experience of the people that whose brain works in that way. And the metaphor that I like to use to explain this is to kind of imagine that you take a polar bear from the Arctic and you plop it in the desert. That polar bear is going to have a very hard time, right? It's not going to be effective. It's going to have heat stroke. And if you did that, you wouldn't say, "Oh, that bear is defective. It should just try harder like all of the, other bears." We would say, well, that environment is not set up well for that bear. And we don't want to change the bear. We want to change the environment so that the bear can flourish. And in the same way, if somebody has, autism or ADHD or something like that, instead of our typical response, which is to say, what if we tried to make that person just like everybody else? What if instead we said, what if we can change the environment, the resources available to that person, so that they can thrive just as they are?
That's a really fascinating metaphor, just in terms of how we see things, because I think I have a thought and a question that's coming to mind, and listeners, bear with me as I formulate this. But we don't often, I don't think we give a lot of thought to how we assimilate. Sometimes that just comes naturally, sometimes it may be forced, but it's either natural or not. Another thing another thing that you said that stood out to me was the idea of the tall versus short, right? And where my brain goes with that thought is, people are not just tall or short. They've got maybe like medium size, but it's also very subjective. So I see one person as short, whereas someone shorter than me may see that person as tall. And I'm going to ask this as a question. That's not necessarily the case with neurodivergent, neurotypical, right? There's not a level of subjectivity involved in classifying those types of people. Is that correct?
So it's complicated because, as I mentioned, like it's still very much a emerging conversation. And it's a little bit complex to sort of say, well, who counts as being neurodivergent? Do you need to have a official diagnosis from a professional? Or, like, is it okay if you don't have a diagnosis? Is something like, having, PTSD or an anxiety disorder, that, like, would that count as neurodivergence? Or is it only sort of, developmental conditions such as autism or ADHD? And what about somebody who maybe they definitely don't qualify for a diagnosis that a professional might give, but maybe there's just something about them that's different than everybody else. Maybe they have a sensitivity to certain sensory experiences, or they struggle with, maintaining attention, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a diagnosis. Would those things count as neurodivergence? And like I'm not the king of neurodiversity, and so it's not my place to say here's who's in and here's who's out. I think it's maybe better to kind of frame it as sort of like, how can this concept of how our environment shapes our abilities, and how our environments often address typical needs, how can that concept be applied to sort of benefit everybody, so that even if somebody doesn't necessarily identify as neurodivergent, they might still have a need or a support or an accommodation that isn't typically provided, that they might be able to create for themselves, or ask.
That's Wow, I mean, it's fascinating because it leads to a number of questions that I have for you. One, which we'll talk about in just a second, is how you described in the audiobook, your recent audiobook, how we respond to this conversation and mental health using the medical model. And I guess it reminds me that I sort of maybe too much see the world as yes versus no. You either are or you aren't, and that's not necessarily the case. So I hesitate asking this question, but I am wondering, is there data on what percentage of the US population would be considered neurodivergent?
Yeah. So the data is not rock solid because again, this is still an emerging conversation. And because even when we're trying to look for data on things that are a little bit more cut and dry, such as not just neurodivergence in general, but like, you know, what percentage of the population is autistic, even that is a little bit difficult because, you know, people have probably seen the studies about how autism diagnosis rates are rising. And that doesn't mean that more people are becoming autistic. It just means that maybe there were people that were missed before that are now being diagnosed. And in the same way, people that before, or right now might not be considered neurodivergent, maybe in the future, as our understanding expands, that's going to change. So the numbers are loose, but some of the research and the numbers that I've seen do estimate, in the range of 15 to 20% of the population is neurodivergent in one capacity or another, whether that means having a formal diagnosis such as autism or ADHD, or more broadly just having a brain that works kind of outside the norm, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a mental health diagnosis.
So what would you say are some in your experience and from your research, what would you say are some common misconceptions people have about neurodiversity, and how do you address them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the most common misconception that I see is that people who are talking about neurodiversity are sort of attention seekers or trying to get away with something, that somebody's like, oh, I have this challenge, I need this accommodation. And sometimes the response is like, oh, well, that person is just lazy. They just need to try harder. They just, nobody else needs that. Why are they asking for that? And I think that I really want to challenge, that misconception because again, most people have, you know, different strengths and weaknesses that are going to be different from somebody else. And I think just about everybody has probably something in their life that's harder for them than it might be for a typical person. And instead of saying, sort of responding to that with judgment or responding to that with like this suspicion that everybody's trying to get away with something, if we instead assume that, what, people that are asking for help probably need the help, and we can try to find a reasonable way to address that, I think that that would be a much better way of viewing folks that are, kind of talking about, neurodivergence. I don't mean to say that everybody who ever watches a TikTok about ADHD and self-diagnosis is in fact, correct and really has, a condition. Obviously, you can skew too far in the other direction also. But I think that I see more commonly people being denied supports when they really need them, rather than people asking for supports when those aren't necessary.
Sure. And I mean, would you agree with the notion that we know our bodies better than anyone? I mean, and it's kind of what it boils down to is yes, maybe there's a level of trust that we have to place on people who articulate that they need a certain accommodation or something, but I mean, we're going to know that best, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think in general, yeah, people, if somebody says, oh, I'm going to work better if, the lights are off in my office, or I'm going to work better if you can explain, the requirements of this assignment to me in writing rather than explaining it to me verbally, probably like you can trust that people are saying that to you accurately. And even if for whatever reason they're not saying that, or
Yeah,
they're wrong or something, it's kind of like what's the harm, right? Like
sure.
obviously there's certain kinds of accommodations that are more strenuous to put in place for somebody, and that maybe you have to go through a legal process to see if it's required to offer that. But my sense is that at least 80% of the time when people are asking for something, it's the sort of thing that could be granted to them without really any significant effort or expense. And it just takes a little bit of compassion and willingness to grant that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have to say, I was particularly struck by how you described how our approach to mental health and neurodivergence is through the medical model as these problems to be fixed. I personally had never really consciously thought of it like that, but it was very eye opening for me. So, as associations, we're often involved in advocacy and education on behalf of our members. So, I think the next question should be of particular interest to them, and that is what strategies or initiatives do you think are most effective in fostering understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity in society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I'd sort of answer it, by weaving it into what you're saying about the medical model by saying that the approach that I think works the best is by helping people carve their like a different path up the same mountain. And by that I mean, you want to make sure that the expectations, that the standards are the same for everybody, because somebody who's neurodivergent, they don't want to be let off easy. They don't want to be infantilized and allowed to produce less than somebody else. But the tools for the approach that might allow somebody else to produce at a high level might not work for them. They might need something different. And within the medical model, oftentimes when we see somebody struggling, our response is to kind of make them quote unquote normal, to say, oh, this is a problem within the person. We need to change the person so they're like everybody else, which again, I like medicine and the medical model works great for a lot of things. If I have a broken arm, I don't want the doctor to tell me that my arm is beautiful just as it is. I want them to fix my broken arm. But when it comes to something that's not a medical issue, but just a different way of being, then our response shouldn't be, let's try to make you like everybody else, but rather, what do you need to succeed and flourish at the highest level just as you are? And so to be able to kind of work creatively with somebody to say, you need to get to the same place as everybody else, but what might you need that's different that gets you to that same ultimate place of success and output?
So, I wanted to share a quote from the audiobook that was shared by your co-author, Kyler. And it there's like four parts to this question, I'll be honest. But the quote was, in the real world, choosing authenticity can mean losing acceptance. Now, personally, that resonates as a member of the LGBTQIA community. And you also you a few minutes ago, you mentioned how seemingly more and more cases, I'm putting in air quotes, of ADHD are coming out, or autistic, diagnoses. But in the reality, it's likely because it wasn't safe. So in my community, right, like 40 years ago, it was less safe to be out of the closet than it is today. So uh, there's a number of questions that I have around this, but I think what I want to dive into is, can you discuss the intersectionality of neurodiversity with other identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, and how it impacts their experience? Because in my own brain, it seems like it only continues to compound the issue of really feeling like you can be your authentic self.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. This is one of the major areas where, in order to really understand it, you have to view it through this intersectional lens, because the different aspects of somebody's identity are going to interact with each other, and the different aspects of somebody's identity that might have some privilege attached to that are going to change the experiences of the parts of their identity where there's less privilege, or where society doesn't view that with as much acceptance. And so, for myself, like, I'm autistic and I've had a set of challenges that come from that, but many of those challenges were mediated by the fact that, I'm a white dude. And, if I had been, like, we know, for instance, that a lot of times, you know, like, black students are more likely to have teachers, use harsh discipline with them, or treat them as troublemakers, or for erratic behavior to cause the police to be called and have a bad experience. And so, there might have been times as I was growing up that if I had had a different skin color, instead of a teacher maybe reaching out and offering me compassion for my, you know, non-normative autistic behavior, instead I would have gotten in big trouble and gone on a different pathway. And so understanding those things kind of together, I think is critical to understand the overall experience. And I think it's especially important when understanding sort of this concept of masking, which is this idea where neurodivergent people feel this pressure to kind of present a neurotypical version of themselves to the world. So they pretend to, like they suppress all those different parts of themselves that they feel are not acceptable. And the more parts of yourself you have to suppress, the harder it is. And so if I'm, an autistic person and I'm suppressing my stimming, but, let's say I was also a member of a sexual minority and I had to, be quiet about who I loved, or, let's say I was a member of, an ethnic minority and I had to code switch to fit in with white culture. All of those things compound on each other and become harder and harder and harder to deal with. And so this is part of why obviously greater acceptance, greater inclusion is critical, in all places, and every place where we can make it safe for somebody to bring their real self is a place where, we can see benefits in terms of, all sorts of mental health outcomes, all sorts of better professional outcomes. But yeah, like this isn't just a touchy feely thing. Having to suppress who you are causes real damage. And the more parts of yourself you have to suppress, the harder it is to carry.
Yeah, for sure. And the title of it's really hitting me actually right now as you're talking. I think at least what you and your co-author meant by this myth of normal, right? Because the more that I'm thinking about it, what really is normal in society? Because we just talked about sexual orientation identity. What really would be classified as normal? We've talked about racial and ethnicity communities and groups and what is normal. And so I think it's really challenging even the use of that word for me. And that sort of leads me to this next question of, in a world that appreciates for ease of operations and implementation, in a world that appreciates standardization in a lot of ways, how do you approach this idea of inclusivity and accommodation for neurodiverse individuals, whether it's in education, the workplace? And what are ways that we can create physical and social spaces that really are designed for everyone to thrive and meet everyone's needs, not just those who are neurotypical?
That's a great question. I think one of the starting places is really to challenge this myth of normal. And, if you want to have the full unpacking, you gotta, pick up the audiobook. But we talk a lot about how it's a myth because, like there really is, if you peel back the curtain, there really is no such thing as normal because there's just so many variations across all of these different domains of human experience. And so trying to say, oh, this is what is, normal is kind of an impossible task. And I think that the thing that's also important to realize about normal is that oftentimes we treat normal as prescriptive rather than descriptive, and that's where the damage really comes from. Because we might say, oh well, this is more common, which could be true, right? It is more common for somebody to not be autistic, for instance. But then we say, oh, because it's common, that's what it should be. That's what, there's something wrong with you if you're not typical. And that part is the part where the damage comes from. And so that's why I'm very like careful to use language such as typical rather than normal, because normal carries a judgment with it. Like if I say it's not normal to enjoy stamp collecting, I'm kind of suggesting that there's something wrong with collecting stamps, which is, it's nothing wrong with it. It's not harming anybody. But if I say it's not typical to collect stamps, it's probably true. I don't have the stats on the stamp collecting in front of me, but it's probably less common than people that want to watch the Super Bowl or whatever. But framing it in that way doesn't cast any judgment. And so I think changing our language around normal and not normal, I think is part of the pathway forward. And I think that the other thing is rather than focusing on sort of normal or typical, I think asking the question of what are our values? What do we care about as a society, as a workplace, as a social group, as a family, whatever your group is that you're in, if you can unite around values, well, those values can be universal, because people get to choose what kind of values they live out. So if you say this is an environment where we value everybody working hard, well, then everybody can work hard. It's just that the way that I work hard look different than the way that a person with ADHD might work hard. Or if we say this is a place where we value kindness, the way that I'm kind as an autistic person that might prefer more direct communication might be different than how somebody is kind that knows how to give a really subtle message. But in both cases, we can be held to the standard of kindness, and we can be unified around.
This is all very fascinating to me for a number of reasons. I think, how I was raised and where and how I grew up, I'm really challenged by this myth of normal, because it's like the idea that you want to build for the most common, right? And I think it challenges me because that normal, that most common, doesn't exist in a way that doesn't hurt others in some way, shape, or form. And so it's challenging me quite a bit. So I appreciate it. For people who are listening in who may wonder or may already be navigating life as a neurodiverse individual, what advice would you give individuals who are navigating these social norms and expectations?
Yeah, I think there's maybe two things that I would offer. I think I one part is to recognize that maybe some of the things that you struggle with are the result of wounds that you encountered along the way because of how people have mistreated you, because of how people have misunderstood you. And so certain things where you're like, why is this so hard for me? Why is this so painful for me? Is there something wrong with me? Am I just lazy? Am I just weak? I think that the compassionate view is that, like, you're not lazy, you're not weak. You experienced a wound. Like, if you have a lot of times where maybe people rejected you, then trying to go out and engage socially, of course, that's going to take a lot of courage. Of course, that's going to be frightening. Of course, you might have a difficult time doing that during a period of your life where you're otherwise stressed out or overwhelmed. Or if you, in academic environments, you've gotten a lot of bad grades because people didn't understand, maybe that you needed extra time on assignments or something like that. Then of course, trying to demonstrate your knowledge and your intellect might bring up anxiety, might bring up, avoidance. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, doesn't mean that you're flawed. It's again just a wound that needs to heal. And I think that the other part that I would offer is that probably the best thing you can do for yourself is to find at least one safe place or one safe relationship where you can be yourself as much as possible. Because you know, I still need to, mask aspects of myself in a lot of my day-to-day life because we live in a society where if I'm in the middle of the grocery store and I want to start stimming because there's a, Star Wars toy on the shelf and that's fun for me. Like, if I do that as an adult man, I might, get kicked out of the store or something. So I have to mask that. But if I'm around, my partner, if I'm around my closest friends, then even though I might feel anxious about showing that side of myself, I can show that side of myself. That would be welcome. That would be accepted. That would even be appreciated because people that love you want to see all of you. And so I think it's obviously a little easier said than done to find those places of community and acceptance. But I think to the extent that you have those in your life, to really make use of them, to lean in, to trust them with your real self. And to the extent that you don't have those, if you're sitting here and you're like, yeah, Daniel, I'm listening to this and I don't really have anybody, to start on that pathway, which might be as simple as starting by going to a therapist because they're going to be a safe person most of the time, finding a support group, something of that nature where you can start that journey towards finding acceptance for yourself.
Yeah, and it sounds like it, based on what you're sharing and also how you described, which I appreciated how you described stemming, which was a new concept for me in the audiobook, and how even around some of the people who were closest to you, you had a partner at the time and you still didn't feel comfortable stemming around them, even though, as you described, you knew that there was unconditional love there for you, right? And I think so this is really, really vulnerable work and self-reflective. And I don't know, maybe this is too bold to say, but it doesn't feel like work that can be done on our own. It it really requires the love and compassion and support and even mediation of people around us.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, the thing that's coming to mind for me in this, this isn't my community. So I might be misunderstanding this or whatever, but my understanding is that part of why pride events are so powerful is because it's this chance to kind of go out in public around other people and to be like, this is who I am. And I can be, you know, like really true and really supported in a community around that. I don't have to limit that to just this tiny little window or try to have self-love by myself, in the corner, but I can be in the middle of town square, and I can have a community of strength around me that all sees me and accepts me for who I am. And I
Yeah.
think that that's the kind of thing that leads to, this acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely that community. So what do you see looking ahead? I guess what do you hope to see in terms of advancements or changes in how we perceive and accommodate neurodiversity?
Yeah. I think one of the big changes that I would hope to see is that in we would move more towards what's called universal design in how we set up our community spaces. And universal design, it's kind of a concept from like architecture or whatever, which is sort of an idea of like, if I put in a staircase, that only works for some people, but if I put in a ramp, that works for everybody. And so why not just put in a ramp? Because it works for everybody. And I think in the same way, if we are designing a social event, is there a way where we could, maybe be a little bit more explicit in how we write the invitation, so that even if somebody might be autistic and they don't understand the subtext, they can still understand what needs to happen at the party? Or, can we, as we are designing our workplace environments, can we set it up so that if somebody has ADHD and maybe they need a little bit more stimulation as they work, that can sort of be accommodated, and it's just sort of set up so it works automatically for everybody. I think that that's one thing that I would hope for. I think another thing that I would hope for would be a bias towards saying yes, when somebody is asking for support without them needing to justify it or, provide a doctor's note or something like that. Like again, obviously if somebody's like, hey, I need a $10,000 fancy whatever, because that's, okay, then you got to go through a formal process. But if somebody's like, hey, is it okay if I turn the lights off in my office? Is it okay if I wear earplugs? Those things like that, like, don't make them go through 50 different forms. Don't make them get a doctor's note. Just say, yes, we want you to be your best self here. And if that's what it takes, you know yourself best. And so let's do it.
I love it. If you're not familiar with the association community and world though, and you may be, and I apologize, but one of the things though that we struggle with is change. We are bound by rules and bylaws and structures that have been around sometimes, since the 1800s. And so, no joke. So, I think this episode is really going to challenge people in a very good way, because the other thing about the association community and world is that we're all very people oriented. We very similar to the nonprofit community. The association leaders that I know have some of the biggest hearts. They want to do right by their members. They have a passion for service. And so I think this is really going to challenge our thinking and how we operate on a day-to-day basis and fill us with the inspiration and awareness that we need to be and do better. So that being said, I'll put one more plug in for your newest audiobook, Neurodiversity and the Myth of Normal. Check it out on Amazon. But if people would like to learn more about you or connect with you after hearing this episode, how could they be in touch?
Yeah. So if you go to danielwendler.com, WENDLER.com, and then Daniel, the typical way, then that website has more information about me, and the contact form on that website goes right into my inbox. And so if anybody wants to ask follow-up questions, if they're interested in having me share more about this and stuff with their organization, all that stuff, danielwendler.com, that's the best place. And then also if you go on Amazon, YouTube, search for my name, you can find books, talks, things like that I've done on those platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I so appreciate it. And thanks again to Visit Bloomington for sponsoring today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Hear This. If you have any questions you'd like answered or future topics you'd like us to explore, please send us an email at info@isae.org. Thank you for your leadership of your associations, and I'll see you over on the next episode of You Should Hear This.